she happened to say, well, it would be nice if people knew more about the First Amendment. And when she said that, we said, that's what we need to do. People do need to know more about the First Amendment and how it is the cornerstone of democracy. So suddenly, this project that was more about restoring this, fantastic house became a much bigger story.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. I'm here today with Genie Gannett, who's the founder, co-founder, and CEO of the First Amendment Museum in Augusta, Maine. Jeannie, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm delighted to be here and chat with you.
Well, glad that you made the time. I want to hear about your museum and the programming that you have, and we'll get to that in a moment. But if we could first focus on the building itself. This building that was built in 1911, I believe, and sits
It
right on
was?
State Street. If you could take a few moments to try to work us through the history of the actual building that this museum now calls its home, and tell us a bit about how it was started and your family ties to the building.
Well, it's a very sweet story, Justin. This house was built by my great grandfather and given to my grandparents as a wedding gift in 1911. Now they got married in I think 1902, but so it was a belated wedding gift. But it's a beautiful building. It's a what we call uh, Renaissance revival or Mediterranean revival is another common word for it. Unusual architecture for this neck of the woods, but it's a lovely home. It's interesting that my both my great grandfather and grandfather were in the publishing business, and the house sits just two doors down from the State House. And we don't think it was any real surprise, or it didn't just happen that they found a vacant lot next to the government, the seat of government. We think that it was specifically put here um, to elevate their place in publishing as well as being watchdogs.
So tell us a
They
little
don't.
bit about your grandfather, but I guess your great grandfather first, because knowing the history of those two, it should come as no surprise that nearly 100 years later, we now have a First Amendment museum sitting on this site.
In the same
Tell us about
place.
your great grandfather first and his introduction to the publishing business.
Well, he was a storekeeper. He was a clerk at a store, and so he decided he wanted to start selling some things on around the country, and he had a knack for writing copy, advertising copy, and so he tried a few things to sell, and sold it with what we'd call an advertiser or a penny saver. And he really didn't hit on quite the right thing until he found some patent medicine that he purchased from a chemist in Boston, actually, and decided to start selling that. And he developed a newspaper of sorts, really almost like a home companion. It was called Comfort Magazine, published in Augusta, Maine. And it actually reached a circulation of more than a million. This was back in the early 1880s that this started, and it was only a couple of years before they got to 500,000. Um, and so he found out that he really didn't need to be selling the patent medicine anymore because he had so many other advertisers. And so then he sold off that business and continued to do the publishing. So, in fact, he had the first color press in the United States.
Is
So he's
that
one of the
right?
very first ones to print in color.
And ultimately, this became a family business, correct? Enter
It,
now your grandfather, Guy Gannett. Tell us a bit
Guy
about him.
Gannett, yep. Well, when he was taking over the business, he realized that, and this was in the early 20s, he it worked for the company before that, But by the early 20s, it was clear that the need for the Comfort magazine had passed. In other words, that magazine went out into farm country and all across the country, where families really didn't have the access to town to go and shop and buy things. And that's why Comfort magazine was so popular. But then when people got cars, they were able to drive into town. And so the need for a mail order type publication really was waning. But my grandfather, Guy, said, well, then we should go into the newspaper business. And he broke away from his dad and started the newspaper. He didn't start a newspaper, he purchased. He purchased the Waterville Sentinel. And then from there, the Portland Herald and the Portland Press, and he combined those. Portland Evening Express came later, and then of course the Sunday newspaper as well. So eventually, it was 5 newspapers. And another interesting thing about my grandfather was he was both my great grandfather and grandfather were very enthusiastic. Aviation enthusiasts. They weren't pilots, they weren't aviators, but aviation was brand new, and they just were so interested in it that, and at this time, the government was looking for people to start up radio stations. My understanding is that because of the World War I and then World War II coming on the horizon, that he went into the broadcast business also. So with those two, with the aviation and then the broadcasting, he and a couple of other folks decided that they would form the Civil Air Patrol. And so Guy Gannett was also a founder of the Civil Air Patrol.
It's fascinating.
It is a fascinating story that he went into that as well.
And around this time that your grandfather Guy is pursuing these ventures through newspapers and radio and TV, your grandmother had some activism of her own First Amendment connections when it came to political speech. Tell me a little bit about that and some stories involving your grandmother.
Well, my grandmother Anne was a suffragist, and she was the president of the Augusta, Maine, a women's suffrage organization. And so she had her tea parties to try to, drum up support for the cause. She lived right next door, or 2 doors down from the legislature. So she was active in getting that on the ballot, getting suffrage on the ballot in Maine. And so it was eventually. And suffragists, there were suffragists and anti-suffragists, and suffragists wore a yellow, in Maine anyway, it was a yellow daffodil on their lapel. But there were anti-suffragists as well, and they wore a red rose. Now my grandmother was a suffragist, as I said, but my great-grandmother was an anti-suffragist. And so here is my grandfather, Guy, who is in the legislature at the time, who is going in to vote on suffrage, whether this should pass or not. And so his mother is an anti-suffrage, and his wife is a suffragist. So he wore a red rose on one lapel and a yellow daffodil on the other. But we do know that he voted for suffrage because, of course, he had to live with his wife, right? He'd already moved out with his mother. At least that's the joke we tell to go along with it.
So what an interesting time. So you have Guy Gannett, who's pursuing a media empire of his own and various newspaper, radio, TV ventures. You have your grandmother, who is pursuing the right to vote for all women and a way to amplify her own political speech at the ballot box. What's going on with the family home at this time?
Well, they are still living here, and shortly thereafter, they did move to Portland after the building. He built a new building in Portland to house the newspapers, and when that was complete, they did move the family to Portland. And then the house was uh, used by another family member who was actually the general manager at the Kennebec Journal for a time. And after that, the house got out of the family. It, the State Street developed into less of a residential area and more of a professional area, with the state being next door to the Capitol campus. So the Maine Teachers Association was here for a while, but the longest tenant was the state of Maine. And they were here for about 40 years, from the 70s up until 2010. And in 2010, they vacated the building. And that's when my family said, is there an opportunity here to get this house back and to restore it and put it to some good public use? We weren't sure what that was going to be, Justin. So so we talked about it and met, and my co-founder, who was my sister, Terry Hopkins, and I were just sitting trying to, brainstorming, and she happened to say, well, it would be nice if people knew more about the First Amendment. And when she said that, we said, that's what we need to do. People do need to know more about the First Amendment and how it is the cornerstone of democracy. So suddenly this project that was more about restoring this, fantastic house became a much bigger story, and the story to tell about my family's involvement in publishing and freedom of the press. And so we were early on going to focus on freedom of speech and freedom of the press, because, when I was growing up, I didn't know there were three other freedoms in the First Amendment. I only knew those two, but because most of us learned that in high school. But it seemed to us that it was in great need of a boost. In other words, at the time, 40% of Americans couldn't name a single First Amendment freedom, which we saw as something of a problem. And how could we at least do our part to change that? So that's when we said it's a museum. It is an educational institution to kind of fill in the gaps, or actually amplify the learning that teachers are doing in classrooms.
This was a long time coming, right? Your I believe it was your mother, after the home was sold to the state. She had always wished that the house would be brought back into the family, right? Wasn't there always some desire to bring it back into your family and make it a tribute, if you will, to the work within the media and First Amendment rights on behalf of your grandparents?
She really did. She was transplanted to Maine from Florida, and so very unfamiliar territory for her. And Guy, her father-in-law, was so welcoming of her to the family, to the community, and she always felt so grateful to him that she wanted to do something in his honor, which was to restore this house. And so that's what we, in 2010, when the house became vacant, we began our journey to try to purchase the building. And during that time, decided that the First Amendment was really what, we talked about what is the most important part of this work. What does it say in the broader scope of freedom and democracy? And that's when we settled on the First Amendment. It was so fitting, because of my grandparents' role in keeping freedom of the press free, and we just said that's a perfect fit. And it gives the house itself is it needs some work for sure, and we are working on it, but it will be restored to that former glory, as my mother used to say. So we are happy to also be honoring her wishes as we go about this incredible project.
And what does the future hold for the project, for the museum? What do you expect it to look like within the next few years, or even longer than that? What is your overall vision for the home and the museum that you've created?
Well, our mission is to inspire all Americans to live and love their First Amendment freedoms. That does require learning about them, understanding them, and how do we live our freedoms every day? I mean, we sit around the dinner table and we have conversation without worrying that someone is listening. And we're able to go to our place of worship. And mostly we don't think about that. We just go do it. We take it for granted. So we feel like it's important to be able to identify those things that you do every day. And that hopefully will inspire people to go further and become more engaged in their communities and in their democracy.
Well, very much look forward to seeing all the work that you do and having your home transform into the museum that you're envisioning. Very exciting. Thank you very much for taking the time to share some of your family stories and the history of your home, and for all the work that you do on behalf of the First Amendment Museum.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. Thanks for having me.